Hello. Thanks, first of all, to Mark and the museum. When I first started talking to the museum about doing this this book launch there, this was in our former lives, and we talked about having a fish ale themed cocktail hour with vodka cocktails and salmon appetizers. And so while it's a shame that's not happening, I'm pleased that we were still able to move forward and at least this way reach, I believe, a much larger audience than we would have been able to reach if this was an in-person event. So I'm now going to share my screen and get going with the presentation. Okay. So Owls of the Eastern Ice it's a story about an owl. Let's see, where are you gonna go? Sorry, I'm having trouble getting my thing to go to the next. Sorry about this, it's not advancing. Let's hope you advance. There we go, okay. Now it's advancing, perfect. Yeah. So it's a story about a fish-eating owl, but it's also a story about eccentrics, and it's a story about field work, and it's a story about people getting a wide variety of machinery stuck in really out-of-the-way places while looking for owls. It's a story of conservation and the people and the actions behind the scenes, and why what I did halfway around the world ties into our everyday lives here in the United States. So a Blakiston's fish owl is an owl probably unlike any that you've known. For bird watchers, it's one of these holy grails birds, the high-end item on your Christmas wish list. I first found out about fish owls when I was 19 from an old Soviet book about Russian birds by Giroux. There were 4 photos of fish owls in the book, and I was instantly smitten. There was something so mysterious about fish owls. It's huge birds living in impenetrable forest and eating salmon, or in this case, frogs. The photos were so exotic that I was instantly taken in by their mystery. Now, this story takes place in the Russian province of Primorye, which is this little corner down there on the lower right of your screen, about 1% of the country's territory. It's bordered by Russia. It's bordered by China, North Korea, and the Sea of Japan. It's a mountainous area. There are about 2 million people in the province, half of whom live in Vladivostok, and the rest live in smaller cities nearby Vladivostok. The rest of the province is dotted by these small villages of just a couple hundred to a couple thousand people. I think after the next dozen or so slides, you'll understand why I love this place. It's an area of mountains, beautiful coastlines, winding rivers that meander among the mountains, and they're teeming with salmon. And they're home to, the region is home to truly charismatic animals, such as the Amur, or also called the Siberian tiger. There's Amur leopards here. There's about 80 of these cats left in the wild, and most are in Primorye. There's brown bears. In fact, this part of the world is the only place that brown bears and tigers share the same habitat. There's also raccoon dogs, which look like raccoons, but they're true dogs. They're closely related to foxes, and it's the only member of the dog family that hibernates in winter. There's wild boar. There's moose. And if you look at the antlers of this moose, it looks more like deer antlers rather than the moose antlers we're used to here in North America. There's long-tailed Giroux. These are shaggy cliff dwellers, very hard to see. And there's musk deer. I like to call these vampire kangaroos based on their very strong back legs and the canines that the males have protruding from their mouths. the bird life is fantastic as well. And here I'm just going to talk about two: the Steller sea eagle, the largest eagle in the world by weight. You want to get a sense of how big this thing is? Have a look at your hand and then compare it to a track on a beach. These are very large birds. Then the second bird I'm going to highlight is, of course, Blakiston's fish owl. Size-wise, these things are as tall as fire hydrants and weigh the equivalent of 11 crows. And honestly, I never thought I'd ever see one, but I did. In the year 2000, I was in the Peace Corps down here in a small village called Lazo. Giroux, when he took pictures of those fish owls, he was up here in the Bikini River, some 400 kilometers north. I was out on a walk in the forest with a friend, and we saw this big bird, and I knew it was an owl, and I took pictures of it, but honestly, well, now it's obvious that I'd seen a fish owl. At the time, I really wasn't sure. The only field guide I had access to at the time was Birds of the USSR, and this is what the fish owl looked like in that book. So, but fish owl it was, and so what makes fish owls weird? Why are they so bizarre among owls? Well, when people think of owls, there are often two things that come to mind right away. The first is acute hearing. If you look at all these owls here, these different species, you can see these facial discs on their face. It's a feather pattern that channels sound directly to their ear holes, which gives them a highly acute sense of hearing. The barn owl down there on the bottom, they can hunt in complete darkness. Now we look at a fish owl's face. I mean, sure, there's a semblance of a facial disc there, but it's not nearly as defined as most other owl species. Another thing that people tend to think of when they think of owls is silent flight. If you look at this flight feather here, so this is the feather on the wing of a Eurasian eagle owl, which is about the same size as a fish owl. You'll notice on the top there's this leading comb of little protrusions. And what these do is distribute the air as the wing is moving and reduces turbulence, essentially making flight silent. And if you look at a fish owl primary feather, you can see it's absolutely lacking. Now, they don't need these adaptations to find and catch fish, right? The river noise is so loud where these owls hunt that I think they'd go crazy if they had hypersensitive hearing. And the fish don't care if an owl's flapping or not. They're underwater, they can't hear it anyway. Fish owls essentially need two things to be happy fish owls in the wild. They need to have a really, really big tree to nest in. The trees, there's cottonwoods and there's elms, typically that grow big enough, 200-300 years old, that are then big enough to sustain a bird the size of a fish owl. So they need that. There's a few examples of fish owl nest cavities very, very, very high in these huge trees. And then the second thing they need is open water in winter. So these birds stay in these forests year round, and it often dips to the -30s here. And so unfrozen water in winter so they can access their fish prey is not a given. Where I took this picture right upstream from here is a radioactive radon hot spring. And that warms the channel enough that this particular patch of river stays unfrozen reliably year in and year out. And the fish owls really hunt by ambush. They'll sit on a rock, they'll sit on the bank and watch for a fish to move past in shallow water. They'll jump in, talons first, wings back, and catch it. So fish owls are long-lived. There's a record from Japan of a fish owl that's in the late 20s. And they lay 1 or 2 chicks, but only every other year. And once the chick is old enough to leave the nest, it'll stay with its parents for about 1.5 years or more, which is an extremely long period for a young owl to stay with its parents. And then when it leaves to find its own territory, it won't breed until about 3 years old. So if you have something that reproduces slowly, only once every 2 years, gets to sexual maturity late, 3 years, has very, very specific habitat needs, in my business, that's a recipe for disaster. Animals like that become endangered. So historically, fish owls did fine in Primorye and elsewhere in the Russian Far East where they live. There were plenty of big trees, plenty of fish, and they weren't really hunted. These are images here of indigenous Udege who still live in Primorye. And they used to trap fish owls, especially in autumn or early winter, because of the thick fat reserves that they build up. Then they would also use fish owl wings and tails as fans. We can see in the bottom right there. And even under in the Soviet Union, there wasn't too much pressure on fish owls. This map here shows, it's the northern part of Primorye. It's a county, it's Ternay County, and it shows the road network in Ternay County in 1984. So there are only 142 miles of road at the time. Then when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was suddenly all this interest in the natural resources in Primorye. And so by 2005, which is the start of the book and when I started getting involved in this work, this is what that road network looks like in the same space. So we went from less than 150 miles of road to about 3,000 miles of road in just that relatively short 20-year period. And these are all logging roads. So there was a sudden emergence of threats to fish owls, but there were no plans to mitigate the problems. I mean, no one knew enough about fish owls. They were so rare and so understudied that there was no way to do any have any conservation plans for this species. So I hooked up with these two guys. These are two Sergeys, Sergei Avdyuk on the left and Sergei Strumich on the right. Sergei Avdyuk was an engineer in the Soviet era. And when his job evaporated, he kind of became a professional woodsman. And he'd been working with Sergei Strumich, who's an ornithologist at a Vladivostok-based scientific institute. These two had spent about a decade before I got involved, poking around Primorye looking for fish owls. And so they had a sense of where they might find some. And so our plan was to catch fish owls, give them GPS backpacks, which would then tell us where they went, then use that information on fish owl behavior to come up with a conservation plan to protect them. Now, this was my PhD project at the University of Minnesota, and it is a little risky to tie a degree to something so unknown. If the project failed, not only would we not be able to help fish owls, but then I would have wasted years of my life on a failed PhD project. So we broke the project into 3 steps. The first was a several-week expedition to a really remote part of the province, the extreme north of the province, to really get, for me, to get experience in looking for fish owls. And I tell you, the first few weeks of the project really were nuts. So we had to fly in by helicopter because there were no roads leading up there at this point. It was right before the logging came in. And so it was a 4-person team. We had 2 snowmobiles and strapped as much gear as we possibly could to these sleds on the back of the snowmobiles, including barrels of fuel, and went out looking for owls. It was really, we really depended on the kindness of strangers here, for tips about where to go in this unknown river system, and also relying on hunters to give us places to stay. A number of hunters allowed us to use their cabins while we were in this area. And for people in Minnesota who are familiar with cabins on the North Shore of Lake Superior, this isn't exactly that. The conditions were rustic, I would say. But they did, it was a dry roof, and they all had wood stoves and wood for fire, so it was a good place to get out of the elements. So really, yes, we were up there looking for fish owls. There were a couple of things that we were keying in on, a couple of things we were looking for. The first was any open patch of water we'd see, we'd go over and look for tracks. Because the fish owl tracks, first of all, it tells you that yes, there are fish owls in the forest. And then second of all, that could be a place where they might be hunting. The second thing we look for is down feathers clinging to branches. That's a great indication that that there's fish owls nearby, and maybe even a nest tree. And sometimes some of these feathers get to be, they're like these big sausages. And when you have one clinging to a branch like that, it's really, and the sun's hitting it, it's just this almost, neon flag letting you know that there's fish owls nearby. And then trees. If we found a tree that had a hole in it, we'd go up and try to get a sense of whether or not it was a fish owl nest or not. So that was a whirlwind, the first few weeks of this project. Then after a break, Sergey and I went driving on the existing logging road network. We spent a couple months revisiting some of the sites where he had found owls in the past, and also looking for new owls, just to get a sense of where we might be able to work the next season, 2007, to trap some owls. And then I came home to Minnesota. I did some more prep work here. This is a great horned owl at the Raptor Center at the University of Minnesota. The Raptor Center allowed me to come in and practice putting on harnesses, so the little backpacks that our GPS is sat on. They let me practice on their great horned owls who did not like me. And I also learned about different types of trap materials we could use to try to catch fish owls. No one had caught adults really before, so we were really flying blind. And traps for raptors, and I think for all birds, can be very species specific and even individual specific. So something that might work for a bald eagle, for example, might not work for a Cooper's hawk or something. So we didn't really know what kind of trap would work with fish owls. So start of 2007, winter 2007, came back to Ternay, the capital of Ternay County. I still come to Ternay. This is where the Wildlife Conservation Society, who I work for now, we have a field office here. And there should be at least one person from Ternay listening in on this call. So it's a village of 3,000 people. And this is the biggest town. This is the closest town to where we were looking for owls who would come back here and resupply when possible. And then Sergey and I alone in 2007, we just went out to some of these sites where we'd found owls before and started trying to trap. It was a lot of, we were living in tents, so it was cold. And we started out really just looking for where we could find open water. We knew owls lived there, but we still had to find out where they hunted, where we could put our traps. This picture here shows Sergey. He had cut a stump and put a stump in some open water that we found, and then sprinkled snow on top, so if an owl came in and landed, we would know that this was a place where owls hunted, and we could set our traps there. And like I said, we were living in tents, and it was pretty unpleasant. Like not really understanding how to trap. We were having some difficulties, and we were also cold all the time. After a few weeks of this, we had, as we're out looking for owls, or as Sergey was out looking for owls on a different territory, he ran into this guy in the woods. This is Anatoly. He's a hermit. He'd been living for quite some time alone in the woods in an abandoned hydroelectric station. And I had found some fish owl tracks near where his cabin was. So he's like, yeah, come live with me. It'll be great. So we did. So this improved our situation a little bit because we now had at least a roof over our heads and a wood stove, so that was nice. But we continued to have significant troubles in catching owls. And it took months for us to finally get our first bird. A lot of trial and error, and it was I think I've already said this a few times, but it was unpleasant, both physically because it was cold and there was a lot of and also psychologically because of the trouble we were having catching owls. And we were literally stranded for weeks at Anatoly's cabin because of a blizzard. We got almost all the way there in Sergey's pickup truck, and then we had to abandon it in the middle of the road because there was too much snow. We couldn't go forward anymore. Then made it to the cabin and then stayed there trying to catch owls. And eventually, thankfully, we finally caught an owl and were able to move on. Uh, but you know, the field conditions are otherwise what I would call par for the course in probably much of Russia. You know, if you want water, you go to the river and get it with your bucket. If you want fish, you punch a hole in the river and drop your line in. If you want to cook something, you dig a space and start a fire. And you know, the book, Owls of the Eastern Ice, developed really from my field notes from this time. So my notes weren't just of the scientific work, but of other experiences, you know, the troubles we were having, interactions that we had with people, with you know, hunters we'd run into, or in general. And so one of the reasons I started writing the field journal was so that I had a, you know, half hour, 40 minutes, an hour each day to put in earplugs and to sit down and think and convey myself in English, in my own language. You know, the other 23 and a half hours of the day, you know, I was in the absolute depths of all things Russian, and you know, very immersive Russian experience. And so it was cathartic for me to be able to express myself in this way. And so suddenly everything clicked. You know, we'd fiddled with our different trap methodologies, and you know, using a little bit from there, here, a little bit from there, a little bit from there, we got something that worked. And it was just glorious. You know, over a really short period of time, off the top of my head, I don't remember, but it felt like a week. We ended up catching 4 different owls, which was, I was at the point in the field season where I was really second guessing myself and wondering if I should just do something different for my PhD. That one didn't like us. That one didn't either. So when we caught these birds, you know, it was absolutely thrilling. You know, we didn't know how they were going to act, since some of them had really caught an adult. We didn't know what they would be like in the hand. Some birds are very, very aggressive. The fish owls, they just kind of, I think they're so unaccustomed to interactions with other species. I mean, they're really big, so they don't really have natural predators. So the fact that something, you know, runs up and grabs them, I think they were just really in a state of shock. And so you can sort of see it there. There's a little GPS on the back of this bird, you know, again, attached by a little backpack under the wing. And this type of technology is common in wildlife biology. But this was the first time that someone had put a GPS on an owl in Russia. So it was groundbreaking in that respect. And for it to be such a rare bird in Russia too, it was also notable. So over the next few years, so 2008, 2009, and 2010, Sergei and I, Abdayuk and I, expanded the scope of where we were working. So instead of being really close to Cherney, like in 2007, we went further and further, deeper into the forest. And there was this revolving cast of field assistants. We lived in this truck, a Gaz 66, which is a really wonderful all-terrain vehicle, and Russians use them a lot for all kinds of things. And this one had inside there's this custom-built, essentially a 2-room apartment. This is the back, the larger space. So it's a sleeping platform for 3 people, and in the back corner, you can see sort of the foil around the stove pipe. So it's a wood stove, so it's really it can get really toasty in there and quite pleasant. The downside of living in a Gaz with 4 other people in the middle of the forest is that you're in a Gaz living in the middle of the forest with 4 other people. The only place for us to bathe was these radioactive hot springs, so we didn't really bathe that much, or at least I didn't bathe that much. And it's so cold outside. In winter, you've got your big coats, and you've got your boots and all that stuff. It was really quite packed in there. And as an aside, the whole period of my PhD, I've been working with fish owls, I'm essentially leading a double life, right? So I go to Russia and I'm, hanging out with Andre and Shuret catching owls. And then, next thing I know, I'm back in Minnesota doing normal stuff like bowling and getting married. And then next thing I know, I'm back in the gauze with Shurik and Andre catching owls again. So it was a really interesting period of my life, having these, significant extremes between, civilization and eking it by in the wilderness. And anytime there were problems with our machinery, which happened all the time, it was up to us. We had to deal with it. We had our wheel came off, or the tire became unseated from the wheel 80 kilometers from the closest town. So what are you going to do? You can't call AAA. You have to fix it. And this is one of the reasons I really appreciated Sergei Avdyuk. I mean, as I think part of it was his engineer background, but he really was good at fixing things. And it was a really, we would have been stuck in many, many, many places had Sergei not been there with a level head and figured out how to fix some of our problems. It's just another example. If your pickup goes through the ice, you really just have to, if you don't have a winch, you need to wait and hope somebody comes by who does have one. And another issue that we had periodically was, every once in a while there'd be a knock on the gauze door, and people would just show up. Sometimes to drink, sometimes just to see who we were and what we were doing. And even if the timing was bad, if we were working, we had to be hospitable. We had to be gracious hosts. We didn't want to offend anyone local. I mean, you never knew when we would need help from the people that live in these areas. All right. So why does all this matter? What I'm talking to you about? I went over to Russia and I did some stuff with owls. What's the relevance to us in the United States and Minnesota? Well, remember that map I showed you before of all the roads in Tarrant County. So here's just what it looks like. You got the river there, the white line is frozen, and the road kind of cutting across it. Well, there's a tremendous amount of resource extraction that's focused in valleys, because the valleys are where the roads go. There's a lot of timber being harvested, and some of these trees come to the United States. Trees, especially oak from Primorye, it becomes floors in North America. It becomes floors in Europe, and fish too. So fishermen have access to. Fishermen use the roads to get up some of these rivers, and set their traps set nets for salmon. Some of it is poaching, targeting salmon and roe, but the fish that's legally caught is sold all across Asia. And so what happens in Primorye, like how the resources in Primorye are managed, matters to the world. So this map here shows the results of some of our GPS work. So all the different colors are locations from a single fish owl. And as you can see, all the GPS locations are also right in the valley. And this is how we can use science to inform conservation. So we have, all this resource use by humans who are using these valleys, using these roads. And we have these fish owls who are using that exact same landscape feature. So how can we come up with something that works for both people and for the owls? So one thing that we did was we made a map of the region showing the high value landscape patches for fish owls. And then we shared this with the primary logging company in the region. It's the largest logging company in the entire Russian Far East. And so this map shows the logging company which specific patches of valley to avoid for road construction and harvest. And we're also working with them to close it. To this day, we're doing this, working with the primary logging company to reduce access to very specific roads that the logging company doesn't necessarily need anymore, but is being used by poachers and others, but is also a high biodiversity area. So maybe that's good fish owl habitat back there, maybe that's good tiger habitat, but the logging company is blocking off access to a selection of these roads. Now, another thing that came out of this project was, all these nest trees are from one territory, the Sayone territory. And over a 10-year period, we noticed that the pair that lived there, so long-lived birds, they had gone through 4 nest trees in 10 years. So mostly these trees are just old. You know, you get a tree that's 200-300 years old and you get a seasonal typhoon come through, it's not going to last as well as it did if it was younger. But also we did have the one nest tree was cut down to be used in bridge construction. So at Sayone, there were no more trees suitable for fish owls to nest in. So the birds were there, they were living there, but because there were no trees to nest in, they simply stopped breeding. So Sergei and I took cues from our Japanese colleagues. So there's fewer than 200 fish owls in Japan, highly endangered. And one of the reasons for that is there are almost no nest trees left. And so since 1982, hundreds of nest boxes have been erected on Hokkaido Island. And this is one of them. Now, when fish owl researchers in Japan want to put up a new nest box, it's a custom order. They call it in. The mold is poured. The little entrance there is lined with oak, and these things cost more than $1,000 for one of these guys. So Sergei looked around the market in Vladivostok and got a good deal on a dozen of these things. He paid about 20 bucks each. These are plastic barrels that used to have soybean oil in them, and cut a hole in the side, painted it, nailed a perch to the front. We went out to Sayone and put it up in a tree. We put a camera trap up there, so a camera that's triggered by motion, just to see if the fish owls ever actually found it. And they did. And it took them less than a week to find this spot. And since then, so since 2015, the resident pair of fish owls has raised at least three chicks in this nest. And we've set up more boxes in other territories, and only some of them are being used. But these are owls that would otherwise not be in the world. So this project has been very satisfying. Wildlife conservation, like many professions, it's filled with uncertainty. We can spend our entire lives designing studies and collecting data and using that information to guide conservation, but sometimes it's hard to know if our efforts have any real impact. And so knowing that right now there are fish owls flapping around Primorye because Sergei and I strap barrels to trees, because we're working with loggers to reduce the harm of that industry, and we're limiting road access to areas important to owls, I mean, it feels good. It gives me hope, and it gives hope for the future of an endangered species. I have to say, though, that the owls themselves do not always appreciate our efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. All right, hello everyone. I am Michelle Massey, and I'm from the Museum of Russian Art. It's such an honor, Jonathan, to be able to share this book launch with you, and thank you for sharing this presentation with over 400 of you listening. This is really exciting. Our first virtual event at the museum. And if you haven't been to the museum, you can see it right behind me right here. Just to repeat a couple of things before we go to the next section of our presentation. You can receive a signed copy of Jonathan's book. We do have copies in the shop at the museum store. So if you are local, feel free to stop by. We'd love to have you. If you're not, we're happy to ship one to you. And in the chat, I'm going to be posting the contact information on our part of our staff who will be taking care of those. So we would love to give you, you never know what Jonathan might write in one of his books, right? Could be in Russian, you never know. So also, as we go to the next part, if any of you, because there are so many of you, if you could turn off video so that we can focus on the speakers, that would be great. And also, I will be posting a link to donate to the museum and for membership. This is a free program, and we're really happy to be able to provide that. But if you'd like to support the museum, we'd love that too. And with that, I'd like to bring us into the interview and Q&A section of our program. Now, anytime if you have a question, you can send it via chat, and it's only going to be seen by myself, Lori, and Jonathan, so it won't be seen by the entire group. Feel free to send us a chat question, and we'll get to those questions after the interview. And so now, all that housekeeping aside, I'm honored that we can bring our special guest here to have a conversation with Jonathan. She is the senior editor for books at the Minneapolis Star Tribune. Please welcome Lori Herzl.
Hi, Jonathan. How are you?
Oh, good, good. Nice to see you.
Very nice to virtually meet you. What a great presentation. There are some very weird animals where you were. I have to say, I was expecting a slide of a jackalope at some point, you know. Did you ever see one of those tigers?
Tigers, yes. I've seen tigers. I haven't seen leopards, but I've seen just about everything else on that list. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, your interest in Russia came before your interest in owls, is that right?
Yes, my father was a U.S. diplomat stationed in Moscow in the early 1990s. So my first trips to Russia were to Moscow. Yeah, and I didn't know about the owl then.
Okay, and the first time you saw the owl was purely by chance, right? You were still just a kid, and you didn't know what it was, or you thought maybe, but.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was in the Peace Corps, so I wasn't exactly a kid, but right, yeah, I wasn't sure. I knew it was an owl, but I couldn't. It was really tough to get field guides of any kind to the region back then. So while I got this book that had fish owls when I was 19. I didn't take that with me when I went in the Peace Corps, so I didn't have this record of the birds. I just had that Birds of the USSR, which wasn't great for that part of Russia.
So when you settled on this for your doctorate, I know you kind of talked about this a little bit, but I'm just wondering how you knew you were going to be able to find these owls. I mean, this was sort of a huge risk that you were taking, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. And I mean, I guess it was a leap of faith. But, you know, when people tend to enter PhD programs in the United States, you look at some of the topics in it, and no disrespect to my colleagues, but a lot of the PhD topics are getting pretty into the weeds on some of these bird species because so much has already been done in North America. And so with the fish owls, like the plan was see what happens, you know, catch some and see what they do. And so I felt like even if the project was to some degree, you know, we couldn't do everything we wanted to set out to do, I still had hope that we would learn something fundamentally new that I could turn into a dissertation.
And you did. And a book. Before we go on with questions, I wondered if you wanted to read a little bit from your book.
Sure, yeah. I think the best spot, honestly, is just to start from the beginning, which sort of explains, recounts the first time I saw one of these birds. So I think this is about 3 minutes, just it's the prologue to the book. I saw my first Blakiston's fish owl in the Russian province of Primorye, a coastal talon of land hooking south into the belly of Northeast Asia. This is a remote corner of the world, not far from where Russia, China, and North Korea meet in a tangle of mountains and barbed wire. On a hike in the forest there in 2000, a companion and I unexpectedly flushed an enormous and panicked bird. Taken to the air with labored flaps, it hooted its displeasure, then landed for a moment in the bare canopy perhaps a dozen meters above our heads. This disheveled mass of wood-chip brown regarded us warily with electric yellow eyes. We were uncertain at first which bird actually we'd come across. It was clearly an owl, but bigger than any I'd seen, about the size of an eagle, but fluffier and more portly, with enormous ear tufts. Backlit by that hazy gray of a winter sky, it seemed almost too big and too comical to be a real bird, as if someone had hastily glued fistfuls of feathers to a yearling bear, then propped the dazed beast in the tree. Having decided that we were a threat, the creature pivoted to escape, crashing through the trees as its 2-meter wingspan clipped the lattice of branches. Flakes of displaced bark spiraled down as the bird flew out of sight. I'd been coming to Primorye for 5 years at this point. I'd spent most of my early life in cities, and my vision of the world was dominated by human-crafted landscapes. Then, flying from Moscow the summer I was 19, accompanying my father on a business trip, I saw the sun glinting off a sea of rolling green mountains, lush, thick, and unbroken. Dramatic ridges rose high, then drooped into low valleys, waves that scrolled past for kilometer after kilometer as I watched, transfixed. I saw no villages, no roads, and no people. This was Primorye. I fell in love. After that initial short visit, I returned to Primorye for 6 months of study as an undergraduate, and then spent 3 years there in the Peace Corps. I was only a casual birdwatcher at first. It was a hobby I'd picked up in college. Each trip to Russia's Far East, however, fueled my fascination with Primorye's wildness. I became more interested and more focused on its birds. In the Peace Corps, I befriended local ornithologists, further developed my Russian language skills, and spent countless hours of my free time tagging along with them to learn bird songs and assist on various research projects. This was when I saw my first fish owl and realized my passion could become a profession. I'd known about fish owls for almost as long as I'd known about Primorye. For me, fish owls were like a beautiful thought I couldn't quite articulate. They evoked the same wondrous longing as some distant place I'd always wanted to visit, but didn't really know much about. I pondered fish owls and felt cool from the canopy shadows they hid in, and smelled moss clinging to riverside stones. Immediately after scaring off the owl, I scanned through my dog-eared field guide, but no species seemed to fit. The fish owl painted there reminded me more of a dour trash can than the defiant, floppy goblin we'd just seen, and neither matched the fish owl in my mind. I didn't have to guess too long about what species I'd spotted, though. I'd taken photos. My grainy shots eventually made their way to an ornithologist in Vladivostok named Sergei Surmuch, the only person working with fish owls in the region. It turned out that no scientist had seen a Blakiston's fish owl so far south in 100 years, and my photographs were evidence that this rare, reclusive species still persisted.
So I have to ask you about writing this book. You said that you took extensive field notes and it was a way to kind of think about what you had seen and immerse yourself back in English. But did you know at the time that you were going to write a book, or was that somewhere, when did that start getting in the back of your head?
Yeah, I mean, with my field notes, I would compile them into PDFs. And whenever we'd get back to Ternay, whenever I got to an internet connection, I would send out what I call fish owl updates to friends, to family, and to donors because I was writing grants to fund all this work, just to keep people excited, to give people updates about what I was doing and the goings on. And it was one of those donors, a woman named Rebecca Rose from the Columbus Zoo, who was like, "When are you going to write a book?" And so that was sort of the genesis, and that was way early, long before I ever actually thought I'd write a book. Mm-hmm. But it did stick with me, and some of the stories are really lifted directly from those field notes. And I remember getting very positive responses to some of the adventures that happened. And then once at some point, 2016 or so, I thought, well, what would this look like as a book? I just finished a translation and had that published from Indiana University Press. So what would it take to write my own book? So I got all those PDFs, compiled them, and that turned into a 40-page document, which was essentially the core of the book. And then I just expanded on certain episodes, gave more background. And so, I mean, the book almost wrote itself at that point because I had all the information already essentially there. And then I took so many photos during field work that I was able to then really put more detail into my episodes, because I could say exactly what the God of 66 looked like inside, or exactly what somebody looked like, because I had the photo record of it.
I'm pretty sure this book didn't write itself. I mean, I'm wondering where you learned to write, because you have great drama, you have a lot of science, but it doesn't bog the reader down. You've got cliffhangers, you've got action. The thing that maybe is most impressive is that this is a first-person book, and yet you're not writing as though you're the hero of what you're doing. I mean, you're the reader's guide, and you are, you know, the main character, but it's not, it doesn't feel vain. And that's really hard to do. And this is your first book. So I'm wondering, you know, okay, so you had these dispatches, and then I think you wrote blogs or columns for Scientific American.
Yeah.
But did you have writing teachers, or did you work closely with an editor, or is this an innate skill that we can all be really envious of?
Well, no, I didn't really take any, I had no real formal training. And in fact, one of my problems when I did get feedback early on from my editor was that, you know, I didn't understand the jargon. You know, there are all these terms that, you know, I can't even remember what they were, because it was gobbledygook. I didn't know what it meant. So I mean, I do think that, you know, my Diana Finch, my agent, did a nice job of helping me at least getting the start of the book, you know, getting more arc in there. And an early problem with an early draft was that it did read too much like a field journal, where it was, you know, field season started, field season ended, field season started, field season ended, and it got too repetitive. So I had to be a little more creative in how I started and ended chapters to make it flow better and be less choppy. And I did, you know, talking about the vainness of a main character. You know, I had just finished working on this translation of a 1921 book by a Russian explorer, and one thing that really struck me about his writing was that he gave credit where it was due. And he would talk about his mistakes, he would talk about his missteps, and he'd talk about how he relied on other people to save him or correct the problems that he made. And for me, that, you know, for someone writing before the age of the internet, before you could actually look something up and see if that was true or not, I really liked that. I respected that he, you know, he talked about going out to shoot a bear because, you know, macho people go out and shoot bears, and then it's this, you know, 10 pages of how absolutely terrified he was and what a disaster, what a terrible idea. He should never try to do that because this bear almost killed him. You know, that's nothing. You know, other people would come back and be like, yes, you know, I shot the bear, and that's kind of the end of the story, because there were no witnesses. So I really respected that about him, and I tried to some degree model that in or be cognizant of that as I was writing this.
So you didn't have any huge disasters or big missteps, but you did have several things happen that were life-threatening. I mean, there was fire, and there was nearly going through the ice, and I mean, a lot of what you did was kind of, well, extremely dangerous. Was there any time when you thought, my God, I'm going to die?
No, not that I was going to die. Yeah, I mean, and a lot of it honestly was trusting Sergei Avdyuk, and he was such a good, and he still is, he's still doing his work, he's such a good leader in the field. You know, he can make decisions very quickly, and they're often the decision that leads to the least amount of blowback. And so a lot of it was just really just sitting back and hoping for the best, because Sergei was in charge. You know, there's early on in the book, you know, we're crossing this river, this flooded river in a pickup truck, where, you know, the truck is bouncing. You know, it's actually going with the current for a period. And I remember that I had, you know, all my data in a Ziploc bag, like, tucked in my arm, and my hand was on the window crank, ready to roll it down the second we started going, you know, out of control toward the Sea of Japan. So I didn't fear for my life, but I definitely feared for the truck. I feared for all our stuff and what we were going to do if our truck went out into the Sea of Japan.
if your truck went down in the Sea of Japan and you weren't afraid for your life, you,
Oh.
you must be a very good swimmer. One thing that I felt when I was reading your book is that these owls had distinct personalities. You never anthropomorphized. I didn't feel like you were sentimental in any way, but I felt like these were individuals. These were individual birds. Did you feel like you got to know these birds in a certain way?
Some of them, absolutely. There were, especially the birds that we caught every year for a couple of years in a row. And there was a male at one territory was always kind of a doofus. There was a female in another territory who was always very, very strong. Mm-hmm. And there's one bird at the Fata territory where he was mated up the first year that we studied him, and then between seasons his mate, the female, paired up with another male over here. So these guys are singing their duet song, and he's over here singing alone by himself. And it was really sad that he could hear her. She's right there. He can hear her every night. And then the last year of the season, we went to that territory, and he had paired up. He was with someone, and we all high-fived because it was great, because we just felt happy for him. Yeah.
Were you able to determine why she had done that? Because I thought they mated for life.
Yeah, that was our understanding too. So I don't know, and because that happened so early in our study, we were like, wait, is that what all fish owls do? We didn't know, but that's the only pair where that's happened, and we still don't know why. We knew that. So the first year there were two birds at each territory, and then the female over here, we believe was shot and killed. And so for some reason, the female over here liked this guy. I don't know. So things had been fine at both territories, but then when there was this absence over here, maybe he's a better mate. Maybe he's a better fisherman than her old mate. Huh. And when these birds are breeding, the female will sit on the nest. She'll sit on her eggs in the dead of winter. It's -30, and she cannot leave that nest. If she leaves the nest, the egg's going to freeze. So she's completely reliant on the male to bring her food. Mm-hmm. So it could be that her old mate was just not that great at catching fish, and so she decided to try her luck with the other guy.
So before you started your study, there was not a lot of research done on these owls, right?
In Japan, there is. There's full university labs studying these birds there. Okay. But it's different subspecies, but it's also the problems are much different, and that's what we were trying to get around. We were trying to avoid a Japan situation in Russia, where all the trees are gone. There's no fish in the rivers. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of damming of the rivers on Hokkaido, and so there aren't the natural fish migrations anymore. And so we were trying to avoid that. So same species, but the circumstances were very different. And because they're so endangered in Japan, they didn't really touch the wild adults. They would ban juveniles, but they really didn't want to mess too much with the adults. So mm-hmm. what we were doing was, in a way, pioneering. And because of our successes, now they are catching adults in Japan because they see that it can be done safely.
Mm-hmm. Did you learn anything new about the life cycle of the fish owl?
Anything new? I mean,
or anything you didn't expect?
And it's there were some. One thing that was striking was how different some of the some of the behaviors are between the birds in Japan and the birds in Russia. For example, the birds in Japan typically breed every year, and they typically have 2 chicks, whereas in Russia, it's every 2 years that they breed, and often just 1 chick. And I think that has to do with food availability. There's a lot of supplemental feeding of the birds in Japan. Oh. They have all these fish all the time. I feel like they're more confident about being able to produce more. They're better fit, and they're more confident about their ability to raise more owls themselves. So that was an interesting comparison between the two. Uh-huh.
So you were interested in conservation as opposed to preservation, you say in the book. And I'm wondering if you could explain the difference here.
Yeah. Sure. Well, and preservation. I mean, so Russia has a really excellent nature preserve system called the Zapovednik system, and that's strict preservation, where the only people that can go onto these reserves are scientists or until recently, let me say that, scientists and reserve guards. It's changed a little bit now. It's softened, but so there's this preservation mindset of keep everybody out, let nature be as natural as it possibly can. Now, the problem with that, especially in places where humans do live, is you're then denying local people who live in a place the ability to use some of these resources. And that can lead to animosity, for example. And that's problematic. You don't want people shooting animals out of spite because they don't like that a reserve's there. You want people and animals to be able to share the landscape as much as possible. Mm-hmm. And that's really one of the goals of conservation, is to find these workable solutions to have sustainable resource use, to keep people in Tournai, for example, employed as loggers and fishermen. Whereas if it's just if they're not allowed to use the forest, then they don't have jobs, then they're probably going to be poaching anyway.
Right. This is also interesting, and I have more questions, but I'm afraid we're running out of time, and I want to make sure there's time for the audience to ask questions. So I think I'm going to turn this back to Michelle, and she can field some of the audience questions for you.
Absolutely. We have a lot of questions coming in. So a lot of people, Jonathan, want to know about your experiences with the Russian government and any clearances, any experiences you might want to talk about with being able to go and study these owls in Russia.
Sure. Well, I mean, just like in the United States, you require permits to do different things, and it's essential for someone like me to have an official agreement with a Russian scientific institution. And that's one of the benefits of working with Sergei Surmuch, is that because he works at a federal Russian Academy of Sciences institute, we could have these official agreements between my organization and the Russian Academy of Sciences. And I do think it's important to note, I had a colleague at the Wildlife Conservation Society named Peter Zoller used to say that wildlife know no borders, right? Tigers and leopards, they don't know or care that they live on the border of Russia, China, and North Korea. It's a species that occupies the space that is good for it. And so it's important I think it's important for me to focus on that and try not to get too bogged down in politics and just focus on the wildlife. I don't get into too many political conversations with Russians.
Mm-hmm. Would that translate over to your experience with locals as well?
To some degree, yeah. And a benefit of being, I've been going, 95 was the first year I was in Primorye, and I have lifelong friendships, and my organization has good relationships with county governments and provincial governments, and so having those local contacts is also very beneficial to the work we do. But in general, sitting around a table in the middle of the woods with a bottle of vodka, I'd rather not talk politics.
I have a lot of people here asking why did the field season have to be in the wintertime?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I wish it didn't. But first of all, the birds breed in, the courtship period is usually in February, and the female is usually sitting firm on the nest in March. So there's a lot of vocal activity leading up to this. The male is, I can catch you fish. He's very excited. She's making a lot of noise. So, and the easiest way to find a fish owl is to sit somewhere in a valley and just listen. So if you're listening in February, you're more likely to hear an owl than if you're listening in September, for example. And then once you know that owls are in a certain place, they're really shy. They tend to fly away from humans if they see you at distances of 100 to 150 meters. So even in winter, often all you see is this black thing in the distance kind of disappearing. So they're impossible to see. If there's leaves on the trees, you can't see them. And so in winter, first of all, because they're limited by where they can hunt, because only parts of the rivers are unfrozen, you can see tracks in the snow. You can't necessarily see tracks on the rocky riverbank. If there's one of these down feathers swaying in the breeze in December, you can see it because there's no leaves, but you won't be able to see it if it's June. And so that's when they're most visible. They're most detectable in winter, is the short answer.
Thank you. And then I think we have time for just a little bit more personal information about you, Jonathan. There are people asking questions about, first of all, how much weight did you lose when you were on your trips to Russia?
Yeah, it was great. I mean, I was in great shape. I want to say I'd lose 15 pounds, because you go over there, you're on skis, you're hauling water, you're eating meat and fish. I mean, it was a great workout, and the stress too, right? That added to it. I lose a lot of weight over there.
What do you miss the most about those trips?
Probably, being alone in the woods, just, middle of winter on skis, pushing off, looking for owls. I absolutely love it. Going to a new area, walking down to a river and just starting the search. It's not just, I showed some pictures of some of the wildlife there. I mean, you never know what's going to be around the next corner. And it's always fun. It's just such a pleasure. And
wonderful.
I do miss that.
I can understand that. And I think for the last question, just on a light note, what is the first thing that you have to have when you come back from Russia, when you get back here?
Well, it's a very close tie between pizza and beer, which happens usually at the same time. So, I mean, certainly there's beer over there, but it's bland. I like the hoppy ones, so I do.
On a nice light note there. Well, again, Jonathan, it's been such a pleasure having you. To everyone out there listening, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you to Lori and Mark. I'd also like to thank Kelly for her help too. We will be posting this recording on our website probably by the end of the week, and we'll send out a mailing to let everyone know. We'll share it on social media as well. Definitely, check out this book. It's been receiving incredible reviews across the board. And again, if you want a signed copy, we will ship one from the museum, or please stop in and pick up a copy. Thank you, Jonathan. I hope that we'll see each other in person and we can have vodka and salmon sometime soon. And have a good night for everyone else. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you for coming. I appreciate it.